will kill me, but how will you kill my thoughts? Putting eyes in the eyes of death, in the last few moments of my life, Che Guevara were shouting these words and saying that even if he rests forever, but the stream of thought that has started will never end. At the age of 39, this man not only left his mark on the leaves of Athos but also lit a torch of revolution that is still alive 50 years after his death. At the age of 15, when he was asked by the college to go to a political rally, he said that he should go to the rally so that the police would chase him away. Even though he was not there, he sacrificed his life to free this country from the clutches of the American puppet government. He fought for the freedom of not only Cuba but also many other countries. As for some, he remained a stubborn revolutionary who knew how to control his ideas, and this is the same country where Che Guevara became known as a terrorist after taking control of Cuba. If he wanted, he could have ruled Cuba with Fidel Castro for the rest of his life, but Guevara's life was not limited to liberating a country, but he wanted to uproot capitalism from this world. There were people whose purpose of life was to keep the revolution alive. Capitalist countries like America called them terrorists. On the other hand, communist countries called them revolutionary, but the truth is that a person's character is never completely white or completely black. So, in such a case, it will not be right to tie Che Guevara in a single definition. Who was this Che Guevara, and why even after 50 years of his death, he has not been forgotten? Why is Che Guevara still considered the poster boy of revolutions? In this video of today, we start from the beginning of the life of Che Guevara to the last moment of death. Early life. Ernesto Guevara Lynch and Celia de la Serna y Loza gave birth to Ernesto Guevara on June 14, 1928 in Rosario, Argentina. Although his legal name was Ernesto Guevara on his birth certificate, it is occasionally accompanied with de la Serna and/or Lynch. He was the eldest of 5 children in an upper-class Argentine family of pre-independence immigrants with Spanish, Basque, and Irish roots. Guevara's significant 18th-century relatives include Luis Maria Peralta, a wealthy Spanish landowner in colonial California, and Patrick Lynch, who immigrated from Ireland to the Rio de la Plata governorate. In reference to Che's restless disposition, his father stated that, "The first thing to note is that in my son's veins flowed the blood of the Irish rebels." According to Irish actress Maureen O'Hara, Che Guevara was fond of Ireland and would discuss all of the guerrilla warfare that had occurred there. He knows every fight in Ireland, as well as its whole history, and told her that he learned everything about Ireland on his grandmother's knee. Ernestito, as he was then known, had an affinity for the poor from an early age. Growing up in a communist family, Guevara was exposed to a wide range of political viewpoints as a kid. His father, an ardent Republican during the Spanish Civil War, would host soldiers of the battle at the Guevara house. As a young guy, he briefly considered selling insecticides and established a laboratory in his family's garage to experiment with successful talcamaxine mixes under the brand name Vendaval, but was forced to stop his efforts due to a severe asthmatic reaction to the chemicals. Despite recurring bouts of acute asthma that plagued him throughout his childhood, he excelled as an athlete, liking swimming, football, golf, and shooting, as well as becoming an untiring biker. He was an ardent rugby union player, playing fly-half for Club Universitario de Buenos Aires. His aggressive rugby approach earned him the moniker Fuser, a contraction of El Furibundo, furious, and his mother's surname, de la Serna. Intellectual and literary interests. Guevara learned chess from his father and began competing in local competitions at the age of 12. Throughout his life, he had a strong interest in poetry, particularly works by Pablo Neruda, John Keats, Antonio Machado, Federico Garcia Lorca, Gabriela Mistral, Cesar Vallejo, and Walt Whitman. He memorized Rudyard Kipling's If, and José Hernández Martín Fierro. Guevara's home had almost 3,000 books, allowing him to be an ardent and diverse reader, with interests in Karl Marx, William Faulkner, André Gide, Emilio Salgari, and Jules Verne. In addition, he loved the works of Jawaharlal Nehru, Franz Kafka, Albert Camus, Vladimir Lenin, and Jean-Paul Sartre. as well as Anatole France, Friedrich Engels, H. G. Wells, and Robert Frost. He learned to admire Latin American poets such as Horacio Quiroga, Ciro Alegría, Jorge Icaza, Rubén Darío, and Miguel Asturias. Many of these authors' ideas were catalogued in his own handwritten notes of major intellectual notions, terminologies, and ideologies. These included creating analytical drawings of Buddha and Aristotle, as well as researching Bertrand Russell on love and patriotism, Jack London on society, and Nietzsche on the concept of death. He was fascinated by Sigmund Freud's ideas and quoted him on issues ranging from dreams and libido to narcissism and the Oedipus complex. His favorite topics at school were philosophy, mathematics, engineering, political science, sociology, history, and archaeology. A CIA biographical and personality report dated February 13, 1958, and declassified decades later, made note of Guevara's range of academic interests and ability, calling him as quite well-read while noting that Che is fairly intellectual for a Latino. Motorcycle journey. In 1948, Guevara enrolled in the University of Buenos Aires to study medicine. His hunger to explore the world drove him to intersperse his scholastic ambitions with two lengthy introspective journeys that significantly altered his perspective on himself and Latin America's current economic problems. The first expedition, in 1950, was a solo tour of 4,500 kilometers, 2,800 miles, through the remote districts of northern Argentina on a bicycle equipped with a small motor. Guevara then spent 6 months working as a nurse at sea aboard Argentina's commercial marine freighters and oil tankers. His second adventure, in 1951, was a 9-month, 8,000-kilometer, 5,000-mile, continental motorbike journey through South America. For the latter, he took a year off from school to travel with his buddy, Alberto Granado, with the ultimate goal of spending a few weeks volunteering at the San Pablo leper colony in Peru, on the banks of the Amazon River. In Chile, Guevara was enraged by the working conditions of Anaconda's Chuquicamata copper mine, and he was moved by an overnight encounter in the Atacama Desert with a persecuted communist couple who did not even own a blanket, describing them as the shivering flesh and blood victims of capitalist exploitation. On his approach to Machu Picchu, he was astounded by the extreme poverty of the remote rural districts, where peasant farmers worked small pieces of land controlled by wealthy landlords. Later in his voyage, Guevara was particularly struck by the brotherhood among the residents living in a leper colony, noting, "The highest forms of human solidarity and loyalty arise among such lonely and desperate people." Guevara utilized notes from this journey to compose the Motorcycle Diaries, a New York Times bestseller that was transformed into a 2004 film of the same name. Guevara traveled through Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Panama, and Miami, Florida for 20 days before returning to Buenos Aires. By the end of the tour, he saw Latin America as a unified organism in need of a continent-wide liberation strategy, rather than a collection of individual nations. His vision of a borderless, united Hispanic America with a common Latino history was a recurring motif throughout his final revolutionary operations. After returning to Argentina, he finished his studies and earned his medical degree in June 1953. Guevara subsequently observed that, during his travels in Latin America, he came in close contact with poverty, hunger, and disease, as well as the inability to treat a child due to a lack of money, as well as stupefaction provoked by the continual hunger and punishment that motivates a parent to accept the loss of a son as an unimportant accident. Guevara claimed these experiences as convinced him that in order to help these people, he needed to quit the field of medicine and enter the political arena of armed struggle. Early political involvement. Activism in Guatemala. Ernesto Guevara spent a little more than 9 months in Guatemala. On July 7, 1953, Guevara set out again, this time for Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador. On December 10, 1953, before departing for Guatemala, Guevara sent an update to his Aunt Beatriz from San Jose, Costa Rica. In the letter, Guevara describes traveling around the United Fruit Company's domain, which convinced him that the company's capitalist structure was harmful to ordinary citizens. He used an aggressive tone to intimidate his more conservative relatives, and the letter concludes with Guevara swearing on an image of the recently died Joseph Stalin that he will not rest until these octopuses have been vanquished. Later same month, Guevara arrived in Guatemala, where President Jacobo Arbenz led a democratically elected administration aiming to dismantle the latifundia agricultural system through land reform. President Arbenz's land reform initiative aimed to redistribute uncultivated sections of huge land holdings to landless peasants. The United Fruit Company, the largest landowner, was the most affected by the reforms. The Arbenz government had already taken over 225,000 acres, 91,000 hectares, of uncultivated land. Guevara, pleased with the nation's progress, planned to settle in Guatemala to perfect himself and accomplish whatever may be necessary in order to become a true revolutionary. In Guatemala City, Guevara sought out Hilda Gadea Acosta, a Peruvian economist with political clout as a member of the left-wing Alianza Popular Revolucionaria Americana. She introduced Guevara to several high-level officials in the Arbenz government. Guevara then made contact with a group of Fidel Castro-linked Cuban exiles during the attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba on July 26, 1953. During this time, he earned his renowned nickname from his frequent usage of the Argentine filler phrase che, a multi-purpose discourse marker similar to the syllable in Canadian English. During his time in Guatemala, Guevara was sponsored by other Central American exiles, one of whom, Helen Oliva de Holst, gave him with food and housing, detailed her trips to study Marxism in Russia and China, and to whom Guevara dedicated a poem, Invitation al Camino. In May 1954, Communist Czechoslovakia sent a ship with infantry and light artillery weaponry to support the Arbenz regime. They arrived in Puerto Barrios. The U.S. government, tasked by President Eisenhower in 1953 to remove Arbenz from power in the multifaceted CIA operation codenamed PB Success, responded by saturating Guatemala with anti-Arbenz propaganda through radio and airdropped leaflets, and began bombing raids using unmarked planes. The U.S. funded an armed army of anti-Arbenz Guatemalan refugees and mercenaries led by Carlos Castillo Armas to overthrow the Arbenz government. On June 27, Arbenz decided to resign. This allowed Armas and his CIA-assisted men to march into Guatemala City and form a military junta, which voted Armas president on July 7. The Armas administration then consolidated power by rounding up and killing suspected communists, smashing previously thriving labor organizations, and undoing past agrarian improvements. Guevara joined an armed militia established by socialist youths to fight for Arbenz. However, dissatisfied with that group's passivity, Guevara quickly returned to medical responsibilities. After the coup, Arbenz volunteered to fight again, but later sought safety in the Mexican consulate and instructed his international supporters to leave the country. Guevara's repeated urges to resist were observed by coup sympathizers, and he was targeted for assassination. After Gadea was imprisoned, Guevara sought protection at the Argentine consulate. He waited there for several weeks until he acquired a safe-conduct pass and traveled to Mexico. Guevara viewed the United States as an imperialist power that opposed and attempted to destroy any government that sought to address socio-economic inequality in Latin America and other developing countries, following the overthrow of the Arbenz regime and establishment of the right-wing Armas dictatorship. In discussing the coup, Guevara stated, "The United States' deliberate hostility contributed to the collapse of the last Latin American revolutionary democracy, Jacobo Arbenz. Its conspicuous leader was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, who, by coincidence, was also a stakeholder and attorney for the United Fruit Company." Guevara's conviction grew stronger that Marxism, attained via armed struggle and supported by an armed populace, was the only option to change such circumstances. Gadea subsequently stated, "It was Guatemala that finally convinced him of the importance of armed struggle and taking the initiative against imperialism." By the time he departed, he was certain. Exile in Mexico. Guevara worked at the Hospital Infantil de Mexico and in the allergy department of the General Hospital after arriving in Mexico City on September 21, 1954. Besides that, he worked as a news photographer for Latina News Agency and lectured on medicine at the National Autonomous University of Mexico's medicine faculty. His first wife Hilda writes in her memoir My Life with Che that Guevara continued to be profoundly affected by the poverty around him and that for a while he thought about becoming a doctor in Africa. Hilda once quotes Guevara as saying that he considered an elderly washerwoman as representative of the most forgotten and exploited class, and that this fixation with her explains his treatment of her. Hilda eventually discovered a poem that Che had written with a promise to fight for a better world, for a better life for all the poor and exploited, that he had dedicated to the elderly woman. He re-established his friendships with Nico Lopez and the other Cuban refugees he had met in Guatemala during this period. Lopez brought him in contact with Raúl Castro in June 1955, who then introduced him to his older brother, Fidel Castro, the revolutionary leader who had founded the 26th of July movement and was now preparing to topple Fulgencio Batista's government. On the evening of their first meeting, Guevara had a lengthy discussion with Fidel and came to the conclusion that the Cuban was the cause he had been looking for. And he had joined the July 26th movement before the sun came up. This, contrasting personalities aside, Che and Fidel's shared dedication to anti-imperialism from this point on led to what dual biographer Simon Reed Henry called a revolutionary friendship that would change the world between them. By now Guevara believed that authoritarian governments were installed and backed globally by US-controlled companies. He viewed Batista as a US puppet whose strings needed cutting in this manner. Guevara took part in the movement's military training even though his role was to serve as the group's combat medic. The main focus of the training was on learning guerrilla warfare's hit-and-run techniques. Guevara and the others learned and honed the techniques of ambush and swift escape during their strenuous 15-hour marches over mountains, across rivers, and through dense foliage. Guevara was teacher Alberto Bayo's prize student from the beginning as he completed all of the tests with the highest possible score. General Bayo referred to him as the best guerrilla of them all at the end of the course. After that, in September 1955, Guevara wed Hilda in Mexico, and he started working on his plan to help liberate Cuba. Revolution in Cuba. Granma invasion. Castro's initial revolutionary scheme involved attacking Cuba from Mexico using the Granma, an antiquated, leaky cabin cruiser. The 25th of November 1956 saw them depart for Cuba. Just 22 of the 82 soldiers who were attacked by Batista's forces shortly after landing managed to find each other again. Many of the guys were slain in the attack or executed upon arrest. This first violent clash proved to be a pivotal point in Che Guevara's life when he dropped a crate of ammo left by a fugitive comrade and set down his medical supplies. Merely a few of rebels managed to regroup as a disheveled combat unit amidst the Sierra Maestra Mountains, with assistance from Frank Pace Urban Guerrilla Network, the July 26th movement, and the local peasants. After the group withdrew to the Sierra, everyone was unsure of Castro's status until Herbert Matthews' interview with the New York Times published in early 1957. Castro and the rebels were given a persistent, almost legendary image by the piece. Although Guevara was not present for the interview, he became aware of the media's significance in their fight in the months that followed. Guevara referred to these days as the most painful days of the war, as supplies and morale were declining and he was suffering from agonizing walnut-sized cysts on his body due to a mosquito allergy. While hiding among the impoverished subsistence farmers in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, he found that over 40% of the adult population was illiterate, there were no schools, no power, and no access to healthcare. In the course of the conflict, Guevara convinced Castro with competence, diplomacy, and patience, and solidified his position among the guerrilla force. Guevara established grenade factories, constructed bread ovens, and set up schools to teach the illiterate campesinos how to read and write. Guevara also started a newspaper to spread information, health clinics, and workshops to teach military techniques. Fidel Castro promoted the man-time called Castro's Brain 3 years later to the position of Comandante, commander, of a second army column. Function as a leader. Guevara, the second in command, was a strict disciplinarian who occasionally shot defectors. As traitors, deserters faced harsh punishment, and Guevara was known to dispatch teams to hunt down anyone attempting to evade their responsibilities. Guevara thus gained notoriety for his harshness and cruelty. Guevara was also in charge of the summary murders of several persons who were suspected of being spies, informers, or deserters during the guerrilla fight. Guevara wrote about the first execution in his diaries. Eutimio Guerra, a peasant who had guided the Castris guerrillas, was executed for treason after it was revealed that he had taken a 10,000 peso reward for repeatedly disclosing the rebels' location so that the Cuban Air Force could attack them. Moreover, Batista's troops was able to burn down the houses of peasants who supported the revolution thanks to this intelligence. Guerra asked that they end his life quickly, so Che moved forward and gave him a gunshot to the head. Che wrote, "I ended the problem giving him a shot with a .32 pistol in the right side of the brain, with exit orifice in the right temporal lobe, because the situation was uncomfortable for the people and for Eutimio." According to a biographer, his meticulous notations and straightforward description revealed a remarkable detachment to violence by that time in the war. Guevara later turned Eutimio's defection and pre-execution appeal that the revolution take care of his children into a revolutionary parable about redemption through sacrifice in his literary description of the episode, Death of a Traitor. Even though he was a strict and severe man, Guevara saw himself as a teacher to his soldiers, providing them with readings from authors such as Miguel de Cervantes, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Spanish lyric poets when they had time to kill between engagements. In addition to this responsibility, Guevara made sure that his rebel warriors set aside time every day to teach the illiterate campesinos they lived and battled how to read and write, a practice he called the battle against ignorance, and which was inspired by José Martí's idea of literacy without borders. Guevara's subordinate, Tomás Alba, subsequently said of him, "Che was liked, despite being strict and demanding. For him, we would have offered our lives." Guevara was characterized as bold, clever, and an exceptional leader who had great moral authority over his troops by his commanding commander, Fidel Castro. Castro said that Guevara had a tendency toward foolhardiness and took too many chances. In his notebook, Guevara's teenage subordinate Joel Iglesias described such events, mentioning that the adversary even expressed appreciation for Guevara's battle conduct. During one of his combat-wound stories, Iglesias says, "He ran out to me, defying the bullets, threw me over his shoulder, and got me out of there. The guards were afraid to shoot him, but they later informed me that he left a lasting impact on them as they seen him sprint out while holding a revolver lodged in his belt. They dared not fire, heeding no threat." Guevara had a key role in the establishment of the covert radio station Radio Rebelde, Rebel Radio, in February 1958. The station transmitted news and announcements by the July 26 movement to the Cuban people and facilitated radio communication between the increasing number of rebel columns located around the island. It seems that Guevara was motivated to start the station after witnessing how well CIA-supplied radio worked in Guatemala to overthrow Jacobo Arbenz Guzman's administration. In order to put an end to the uprising, Cuban government forces routinely rounded up, tortured, and shot people as a form of intimidation. They even started murdering rebel detainees on the spot. By March 1958, the United States had stopped providing the Cuban government with armaments because to the ongoing atrocities committed by Batista's army. Later, in late July 1958, Guevara was instrumental in the Battle of Los Mercedes when he used his column to block Batista's General Cantillo's 1,500-man force from encircling and decimating Castro's forces. Many years subsequently, USMC Major Larry Bachman evaluated Che's tactical understanding of this fight and called it brilliant. Guevara also developed into a master at using hit-and-run strategies to elude Batista's army and retreat into the countryside before the latter could launch a counteroffensive. Last gasp attack. Guevara oversaw a fresh column of fighters sent westward for the last drive into Havana as the war dragged on. Guevara set off on a strenuous 7-week march on foot, hardly stopping for food for several days and only traveling at night to evade ambushes. Guevara's mission in the final days of December 1958 was to seize Las Villas province in order to divide the island in half. He carried out a string of brilliant tactical victories in a couple of days, giving him control over all but Santa Clara, the province's capital. Following that, Guevara led his suicide squad in the assault on Santa Clara, which turned out to be the last major military triumph of the revolution. There were occasions during the 6 weeks before the conflict when his forces were totally besieged, outnumbered, and overrun. Some analysts still consider Che's eventual victory, despite being outnumbered 10:1, to be a remarkable tour de force in modern warfare. On New Year's Eve 1958, Radio Rebelde carried the first word that Guevara's column had reached Santa Clara. This ran counter to claims from the tightly controlled national news outlets, which had already announced Guevara's passing during the conflict. Fulgencio Batista escaped to the Dominican Republic at 3 a.m. on January 1, 1959, after discovering that his generals were negotiating a separate peace with Guevara. He took with him an estimated wealth of more than $300 million through graft and rewards. Guevara arrived in Havana the next day, January 2, to seize ultimate authority of the city. It took Fidel Castro 6 extra days to reach Havana, having made stops to mobilize supporters in multiple major towns en route to his triumphant arrival on January 8, 1959. 2,000 people lost their lives throughout the 2 years of revolutionary combat. Cuban political career. Tribunals for revolution. Guevara moved into a holiday house in Tarara in mid-January 1959 in order to recuperate from a severe asthma attack. He founded the Tarara group there, which discussed and created new strategies for the social, political, and economic advancement of Cuba. Additionally, when Che was sleeping at Tarara, he started writing his book Guerrilla Warfare. In appreciation of his contribution to the victory, the revolutionary government declared Guevara a Cuban citizen by birth in February. Hilda Gadea arrived in Cuba in late January, and Guevara informed her that he was seeing someone else. They decided to get a divorce, which was consummated on May 22. What to do with the captured Batista officials who had carried out the worst of the repression was the source of the first significant political problem. The Ley de la Sierra, a 19th-century penal code, was adopted into the areas under the general command of the rebel army, led by Fidel Castro, during the uprising against Batista's government. This rule stipulated that major offenses might result in death, regardless of whether they were committed by revolutionaries or the Batista dictatorship. The revolutionary government expanded its jurisdiction in 1959 to include the entire republic and those it deemed to be war criminals who had been apprehended and put on trial following the revolution. The majority of people approved of this last extension, which followed the same protocol as the Allies' Nuremberg trials during World War II, according to the Cuban Ministry of Justice. Castro assigned Guevara the position of commander of the La Cabana Fortress jail for a period of 5 months, from January 2 to June 12, 1959, in order to carry out part of this plan. The new administration put Guevara in charge of eliminating the Batista army and securing victory by enforcing revolutionary justice against people who were thought to be war criminals, traitors, or chivatos, informants. In his capacity as La Cabana's commander, Guevara heard appeals from people found guilty in the revolutionary justice system. 3 army commanders, an assessor, and a well-respected local resident presided over the courts. The tribunal has occasionally sentenced people to death by firing squad. Senior legal counsel to the Ministry of Justice in Cuba, Raul Gómez Treto, has maintained that the death sentence was appropriate to keep individuals from enforcing justice themselves, as was the case in the anti-Machado revolt 20 years prior. Biographers point out that 93% of Cubans supported the tribunal procedure at the time of the study, indicating that the country was in a lynching mood in January 1959. Furthermore, on January 22, 1959, a universal newsreel presented by Ed Herlihy was shown in the United States. In it, Fidel Castro asked an estimated 1 million Cubans if they approved of the executions, to which they responded with a thunderous "Sí." Yes. Estimates of the number of Cubans killed by Batista's collaborators range from 1,000 to 20,000. Many accused war criminals were sentenced to death after being found guilty of torturing and physically abusing people, The newly empowered government carried out executions, which were characterized by protests from the crowds yelling "Al Perdón," and described as "without respect for due process" by biographer Jorge Castañeda. Several hundred persons are thought to have been executed countrywide during this period. However, sources differ. Guevara's jurisdictional death tally at La Cabana ranges from 55 to 105. Divergent opinions abound regarding Guevara's stance on the executions at La Cabana. Exiled opposition biographers spoke of Guevara's enthusiasm for organizing and enjoying the firing squad ceremonies, while some say he released as many detainees as he could. All parties agree that Guevara had become a hardened individual who was unafraid of summary and collective executions as well as the death penalty. If the sole means of defend the revolution was to execute its enemies, he would not be swayed by humanitarian or political arguments. Guevara makes it clear in a letter dated February 5, 1959, to Luis Paredes Lopez in Buenos Aires, "The firing squad executions are not only a necessity for the people of Cuba, but also an imposition of the people." Establishing agricultural land reform was Guevara's second major early platform, in addition to guaranteeing revolutionary justice. On January 27, 1959, very immediately after the revolution was successful, Guevara gave one of his most important addresses, discussing the social ideas of the rebel army. In this speech, he stated that the social justice that land redistribution brings about was the new Cuban government's top priority. A few months later, on May 17, 1959, Guevara's agrarian reform law, which restricted the size of all farms to 1,000 acres, 400 hectares, went into force. Exceeding these restrictions, the government would expropriate any property and hold them as state-run communes or distribute them to peasants in 67-acre, 270,000 square meter, chunks. Additionally, the rules stated that foreigners were not permitted to operate sugar estates in Cuba. He led a march on June 2, 1959. She was a member of the July 26 movement and was born in Cuba. He had been living with her since late 1958. June saw Guevara return to Tarara, a town by the sea, for his honeymoon with Aleida. The military castle of La Cabana hosted a civil ceremony. Guevara would marry twice and have 5 children in total. Early political office. Castro dispatched Guevara on a 3-month journey, beginning on June 12, 1959, that took him through Singapore and Hong Kong, as well as a number of Bandung-pact nations, including Morocco, Sudan, Egypt, Syria, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Castro's decision to expel Guevara from Havana gave the impression that he was breaking with Guevara and his Marxist beliefs, which alarmed the U.S. and some of the July 26 movement's participants. Guevara paid President Sukarno a visit while he was in Jakarta to talk about the country's most recent revolution, 1945 to 1949, and to create trade ties. Sukarno was drawn to Guevara's vivacity and easygoing demeanor, and they quickly became friends. In addition, they both had revolutionary Marxist goals against Western imperialism. Guevara then traveled to Japan for 12 days, from July 15 to 27, when he took part in talks to deepen Cuba's commercial ties with that nation. He said that the Japanese imperialists had killed millions of Asians, and declined to visit and lay a wreath at Japan's Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which honors soldiers lost in World War II. Guevara said that he would instead travel to Hiroshima, the site of the American military's atomic bombing 14 years earlier. Although Guevara denounced Imperial Japan, he thought President Truman was a macabre clown for the bombings. And he said, in order to fight better for peace, one must look at Hiroshima, on a postcard he sent back to Cuba after visiting Hiroshima and its Peace Memorial Museum. By September 1959, when Guevara returned to Cuba, it was clear that Castro had gained political clout. The agrarian reform law had authorized the government to seize land, but the landowners were being offered low-interest bonds as a hedge against compensation offers, which alarmed the U.S. At this juncture, the disgruntled rebel commander Huber Matos joined the affected affluent cattlemen of Camagüey in their campaign against the land redistributions. They were joined in decrying communist encroachment by the anti-communist wing of the July 26 movement. Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, was providing support to the anti-communist Legion of the Caribbean at this time as it was undergoing training there. This multinational group, which included right-wing mercenaries, Croatians, Germans, Greeks, and a large number of Spaniards and Cubans, was preparing to overthrow Castro's new government. Guevara attained the dual roles of President of the National Bank and Minister of Finance at this point. Guevara was the virtual czar of the Cuban economy during the height of his power due to these appointments and his role as Minister of Industries. Guevara was required by custom to sign the Cuban currency, which contained his signature, due to his role as the President of the Central Bank. He signed the bills as Che alone, not using his entire name. Guevara expressed his dislike of money and the divisions it caused between classes through this symbolic deed, which alarmed many in the Cuban banking industry. Later, Guevara's close friend Ricardo Rojo said, the day he signed Che on the bills, it literally knocked the props from under the widespread belief that money was sacred. Threats to international relations increased when, on March 4, 1960, two enormous explosions tore through the French freighter La Coubre, which was docked in Havana harbor and carrying Belgian weapons from the port of Antwerp. Guevara personally administered first aid to some of the victims of the explosions, which resulted in at least 76 deaths and several hundred injuries. The next day, Fidel Castro held a state funeral for the bomb victims and promptly accused the CIA of an act of terrorism. Alberto Corda, who is now known as Guerrillero Heroico, shot the iconic picture of Guevara during the memorial service. Castro killed more counter-revolutionaries, because to perceive threats, and he used Guevara to expedite land reforms significantly. The Cuban government created the National Institute of Agricultural Reform, NRA, to oversee the new agricultural reform law in order to carry out this strategy. INRA swiftly rose to prominence as the country's most significant governing body. With Guevara, in his role as Minister of Industry, leading it, quotation needed to confirm, under Guevara's leadership, INRA organized a 100,000-strong militia that was initially utilized to assist the government in taking over and monitoring the distribution of the confiscated land before being sent to create cooperative farms. Among the land seized were 480,000 acres, 190,000 hectares, held by U.S. businesses. A few months later, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower retaliated by drastically cutting back on U.S. imports of Cuban sugar, the country's principal cash crop. This prompted Guevara to address more than 100,000 workers at a rally in front of the presidential palace on July 10, 1960, denouncing the economic aggression of the U.S. Guevara was characterized as guiding Cuba with icy calculation, vast competence, high intelligence, and a perceptive sense of humor by Time magazine reporters who met with him at this period. Guevara emphasized the necessity for literacy to increase nationally in addition to land reform. Prior to 1959, the official literacy rate in Cuba ranged from 60 to 76%, with the primary contributing factors being limited access to school in rural areas and a shortage of teachers. Thus, at Guevara's request, the Cuban government declared 1961 to be the Year of Education and organized more than 100,000 volunteers into literacy brigades, which were subsequently dispatched into the countryside to build schools, train new teachers, and impart reading and writing skills to the largely illiterate guajiros, peasants. Unlike many of Guevara's later economic initiatives, this campaign was a remarkable success. By the completion of the Cuban literacy campaign, 707,212 adults had been taught to read and write, raising the national literacy rate to 96%. Accompanying literacy, Guevara was also concerned with establishing universal access to higher education. To accomplish this, the new regime introduced affirmative action to the universities. While announcing this new commitment, Guevara told the gathered faculty and students at the University of Los Villas that the days when education was a privilege of the white middle class had ended. The university, he said, must paint itself black, mulatto, worker, and peasant. If it did not, he warned, the people were going to break down its doors, and paint the university the colors they like, Economic reforms and the new man. At the first Latin American Congress in September 1960, Guevara was questioned about Cuba's ideology and he said, "If you were to ask me to describe our revolution as communist, I would say it is Marxist. Through its tactics, our revolution has found the routes that Marx indicated." As a result, Guevara credited political philosopher Karl Marx as his ideological inspiration for implementing and defending Cuban policies. Guevara boldly declared, "There are truths so evident, so much a part of people's knowledge, that it is now useless to discuss them," in defense of his political position. Marxism should come naturally to people, much as Newtonian or Pasteurian ideas do in physics or biology. Guevara stated that the objective of the Cuban revolution's practical revolutionaries was to simply fulfill laws foreseen by Marx, the scientist. Guevara asserted that the laws of Marxism are present in the events of the Cuban Revolution, independent of what its leaders profess or fully know of those laws from a theoretical point of view, drawing on Marx's prophesies and dialectical materialism theory. Marx's contribution is that he abruptly alters the course of social thought history. In addition to forecasting the future, which would fulfill his scientific duty, he interprets history, comprehends its dynamics, and proposes a novel idea: the world needs to be transformed as well as understood. Man transforms from the tool and slave of his surroundings into the creator of his own destiny. Che Guevara, Memoirs for the Analysis of Cuban Ideology, October 1960. When man produces without being physically forced to sell himself as a commodity, he genuinely realizes his full potential as a human being. Guevara and Cuba's new leadership nationalized companies, banks, and factories in an attempt to quickly change the political and economic foundation of the nation and end social inequality. They also made an effort to guarantee that all Cubans had access to affordable housing, healthcare, and work. It was felt that such structural changes needed to be accompanied by a revolution in people's social relations and values for a true transformation of consciousness to occur. Feeling that the island's antiquated history was the source of Cuba's attitudes about women, race, individualism, and physical labor, everyone was exhorted to see one another as equals and adopt the values of what Guevara called El Hombre Nuevo, the new man. Guevara aspired for his new man to be anti-imperialist, gender-blind, incorruptible, selfless and cooperative, obedient and hardworking in the end. Guevara sought to utilize the state to highlight virtues like egalitarianism in order to achieve this. She did this by emphasizing the core principles of Marxism-Leninism and selflessness, while unity, equality, and freedom emerged as the new guiding principles. First and foremost, Guevara wanted to see a national shift away from financial incentives and toward moral ones. This goal aligned with his opposition to wealth concentration and economic inequality. He wanted to witness the emergence of a new man and woman, since he saw capitalism negatively as a contest among wolves, where one can only win at the cost of others. A socialist economy, in Guevara's repeated words, is not worth the effort, sacrifice, and risks of war and destruction if it leads to the promotion of greed and individual ambition at the expense of collective spirit. Guevara's reformation of individual consciousness and values to create better workers and citizens thus became one of his main objectives. He believed that the new man from Cuba would be able to triumph over the egotism and selfishness that he detested and believed to be peculiar to people living in capitalist civilizations. Aside from establishing a number of party-dominated institutions and mechanisms at all societal levels, the government also promoted this idea of a new man by establishing labor unions, youth leagues, women's groups, community centers, and houses of culture that promoted state-sponsored literature, music, and painting. Accordingly, all facilities related to education, the media, and the arts were nationalized and used to propagate the official socialist ideology of the government. Guevara said the following while outlining this new development strategy. Revolutionary development and free enterprise development are very different from one another. In one of them, the wealthiest wheeler dealers, the government's allies, and a fortunate few hold the majority of the wealth. In the other, the people's heritage is their wealth. Guevara felt that voluntarism and willpower were also essential components in building a sense of unity between the individual and the mass. Guevara led by example by working endlessly at his ministry job, in construction, and even cutting sugar cane on his days off in order to demonstrate this. He had a reputation for working 36 hours straight, taking meetings past midnight, and grabbing food on the go. Such actions typified Guevara's new moral incentive program, in which each employee was now expected to reach a quota and create a specific amount of items. Employees who met their quotas received a salary decrease, while those who did not received a certificate of praise, replacing the pay increases that Guevara had repealed. Guevara unabashedly defended his personal work ethic and motivational theory by saying, "This has nothing to do with how many pounds of meat someone can consume, how many beach outings one can have each year, or how many foreign ornaments one can purchase with his existing pay. The important thing is that the person feels more whole, much more responsible, and has a lot more inner depth." Guevara visited many Marxist republics and signed economic agreements with them in an attempt to forge stronger business ties with Eastern Bloc states in the face of dwindling ties with Western powers. He traveled to North Korea, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and East Germany towards the end of 1960. On December 17, 1960, in East Berlin, he signed a trade agreement, for example. Although there was some benefit to Cuba's economy from these deals, there was also a drawback. Cuba became more and more dependent on the Eastern Bloc. Additionally, Guevara met Tamara Bunk, after known as Tanya, in East Germany. She was assigned to serve as his interpreter and eventually joined him in Bolivia, where she was also slain alongside him. Douglas Kellner claims that his programs were a failure and that absenteeism and productivity increased quickly. Guevara faulted the insufficiency of the 1959 agricultural reform law passed by the Cuban government, which divided land among peasants and converted huge plantations into farm cooperatives, during a meeting with French economist René Dumont. Guevara believed that because of the ongoing, heightened sense of individual ownership fostered by this circumstance, workers were still driven to pursue their prior goals of personal material gain rather than the positive societal effects of their labor. Many years later, Ernesto Betancourt, Che's former deputy and eventually the director of U.S. government-funded Radio Martí, accused Guevara of being ignorant of the most elementary economic principles. Betancourt was an early supporter of Castro's who turned critic of the revolutionary leader. The Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs invasion. In the Bay of Pigs invasion, which took place on April 17, 1961, 1,400 Cuban exiles with U.S. training attacked Cuba. Guevara was not involved in most of the battle because the day before the invasion, men under Guevara's command were drawn to the area by a cruiser carrying Marines that pretended to be invading the Pinar del Rio region. Historians do, however, accord him some credit for the triumph because, at the time, he served as the military's director of instruction for Cuba. In his account of the Cuban victory, author Tad Sulk gives Guevara some credit, saying, "The reason the revolutionaries prevailed was due to Che Guevara's exceptional performance in preparing 200,000 men and women for battle as the chief of the Revolutionary Armed Forces Instruction Department. He also had a gunshot graze to the cheek during this deployment after his handgun unintentionally went off in its holster." Che Guevara wrote a letter of gratitude to U.S. President John F. Kennedy in August 1961 while attending the Organization of American States Economic Summit in Punta del Este, Uruguay, via Richard N. Goodwin, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. Grateful for Playa Girón, Bay of Pigs, it said. The revolution was unstable prior to the invasion. It is more powerful than before. Guevara angrily criticized the United States' claim to be a democracy, saying that such a system was incompatible with financial oligarchy, discrimination against blacks, and outrages by the Ku Klux Klan, in response to Treasury Secretary Douglas Dillon of the United States presenting the Alliance for Progress for ratification by the meeting. Guevara went on to criticize the persecution that, in his opinion, sent the Rosenbergs to their deaths against the protests of a shocked world, drove scientists like Oppenheimer from their posts, and deprived the world of the marvelous voice of Paul Robeson for years. Guevara concluded his speech with a sarcastic remark, "U.S. experts never talk about agrarian reform. They prefer a safe subject, like a better water supply," suggesting that the country was not interested in genuine reforms. Put succinctly, they appear to be preparing for the revolution in toilets. Still, Goodwin wrote in his post-meeting memo to President Kennedy that Guevara considered him a member of the newer generation, and that Guevara, who Goodwin claimed had written him a message the day after the meeting through one of the Argentine attendees, whom he called Doretta, thought the meeting was quite profitable. Being essentially the mastermind behind the establishment of the Cuban-Soviet partnership, Guevara was instrumental in delivering the Soviet nuclear-armed ballistic missiles to Cuba, which set off the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis and nearly resulted in global nuclear war. The final agreement was signed by Che Guevara himself on August 30, 1962, in the Soviet Union, following the Soviet proposal to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. Guevara persuaded Khrushchev to make the missile trade public. But the Russian leader insisted on keeping it secret and promised to back the Soviet Union if the Americans found out about the missiles. By the time Guevara reached Cuba, U-2 spy planes had already led the U.S. to learn that the Soviet Union had troops there. A few weeks after the crisis, Guevara was still angry over the alleged Soviet betrayal and told correspondent Sam Russell that they would have launched off the missiles if they had been under Cuban control in an interview with the British communist publication The Daily Worker. Guevara underlined that the potential for millions of atomic war victims would have been worth it in the end for the cause of socialist freedom against worldwide imperialist aggression, while going into further detail about the incident later. Guevara was further persuaded by the missile crisis that the US and the USSR, the two superpowers in the world, were using Cuba as a pawn in their own international plans. After that, he criticized the Soviet Union nearly as much as he criticized the United States. Great Debate. Historians refer to this period of Cuban history as the Great Debate because it was characterized by public discussions on the direction of the country's economic policies between 1962 and 1965. The discussion started after Cuba's economy collapsed in 1962 as a result of years of internal economic issues, U.S. sanctions, and the exodus of professionals from the island. Marxist economists from all around the world were invited by Fidel Castro to discuss two fundamental ideas in 1962. Che Guevara put up the idea that if subjective conditions such as public consciousness and vanguard action are established, Cuba might become an industrialized, communist society right away, eschewing any time of socialist to capitalist transition. The third claim made by the Popular Socialist Party was that before a communist society could be built, Cuba needed to go through a transitional phase as a mixed economy where its sugar industry was optimized for profit. During this time, Guevara expounded on the idea that the primary driver of worker productivity should be the presence of moral incentives. Businesses were required to contribute all profits they made to the state budget, which would also cover any losses. Rather than monetarily motivated increases in production, the key to preserving a route to socialism was thought to be the establishment of socialist consciousness-raising institutions. The use of the profit incentive was seen as a step toward capitalism and as one of the weaknesses of the economies of the former Soviet Union. Centralized planning and mass mobilizations would also be essential to the economy's growth. The primary ideal that undermined the consciousness necessary to bring about socialism was the exaltation of the new man, a citizen driven solely by human solidarity and selflessness. The Cuban economy was restructured along moral principles in 1966. In order to boost output, Cuban propaganda emphasized voluntarism and ideological reasons. Employees who were more productive than others did not receive material incentives. Cuban intellectuals were supposed to put aside their ambition to produce art for art's sake and actively contribute to the development of a healthy national ethos. All non-agricultural private companies were nationalized in 1968, central planning became more ad hoc, and the goal of the Cuban economy as a whole was to produce a sugar harvest of 10 million tons. The resolutions resulting from the Great Debate years prior served as a general inspiration for these developments. The ultimate legacy of the offensive would be that the concentration on sugar would eventually leave all other aspects of the Cuban economy underdeveloped. Global diplomacy. United Nations delegates. Since Che Guevara had become a revolutionary statesman of world stature, by December 1964, he had gone to New York City as the leader of the Cuban delegation to address the UN. Guevara asked, "Can the United Nations do nothing to stop this?" during his hour-long, passionate speech before the UN on December 11, 1964, criticizing the organization's incapacity to address the brutal policy of apartheid in South Africa. Guevara went on to criticize U.S. policy regarding the country's black population, saying, "Those who murder their own children and treat them unfairly on a daily basis because to the color of their skin, those who shield and allow black killers to go free. And penalizing the black community even more for demanding their rightful rights as free men. How can people who act in this way regard themselves as defenders of freedom?" Guevara, furious, concluded his address by reciting the Second Declaration of Havana, which said that Latin America was a family of 200 million brothers who suffer the same miseries. Guevara predicted that the hungry Indian masses, peasants without land, exploited workers, and progressive masses will write this epic. Guevara saw the fight as a battle of ideas and the masses, led by people who had previously been viewed as a weak and submissive flock, but were now being mistreated and scorned by imperialism. Guevara now claimed that Yankee monopoly capitalism horrifyingly saw its gravediggers with this flock. Guevara declared that the anonymous mass will restore those rights that were laughed at by one and all for 500 years, and start writing its own history with its own blood at this hour of vindication. As he concluded his speech to the General Assembly, Guevara made the following predictions: the labor masses who turned the wheel of history were now, for the first time, awakening from the long, brutalizing sleep to which they had been subjected, and that this wave of anger would sweep the lands of Latin America. Later, Guevara found out that Cuban exiles had attempted to kill him twice when he was staying at the UN building. The first was from Molly Gonzalez, who attempted to breach barriers with a 7-inch hunting knife when he arrived, and the second was from Guillermo Novo, who, while giving his speech at the UN headquarters, fired a timed bazooka from a boat in the East River, but it missed and went off target. Guevara later discussed the two instances, saying that it is better to be killed by a woman with a knife than by a man with a gun, and that the explosion had given the whole thing more flavor with a leisurely sweep of his cigar. While in New York, Guevara spoke with a variety of individuals, including associates of Malcolm X and U.S. Senator Eugene McCarthy, as featured on the CBS Sunday news program Face the Nation. The latter read a statement from Guevara to an audience at the Audubon Ballroom, expressing his respect and calling him one of the most revolutionary men in this country right now. Global travel. Guevara began a 3-month world tour on December 17, departing New York for Paris, France. Along the way, he stopped in Prague and Ireland and traveled to the People's Republic of China, North Korea, the United Arab Republic, Algeria, Ghana, Guinea, Mali, Dahomey, Congo-Brazzaville, and Tanzania. Guevara honored his Irish ancestry while he was there and observed St. Patrick's Day in Limerick. During this visit, he sarcastically wrote to his father, saying, "I am in this green Ireland of your ancestors." The television station came to interview me about the Lynch lineage when they found out, but I kept quiet out of fear that they were horse thieves or something. The first thing to note is that in my son's veins flowed the blood of the Irish rebels, Guevara's father was recorded saying in 1969 regarding his son's Irish ancestry. Spanish poet Juan Goytisolo conducted an interview with Guevara inside the Cuban embassy while he was in Algeria. A book written by openly gay Cuban writer Virgilio Pinera was sitting on the table next to Guevara during the conversation. "How dare you have a book by this foul faggot in our embassy?" he cried, hurling the book against the wall. This point in time has been recognized as a turning point in Goytisolo's personal development since it encouraged him to gradually come out as gay and start showing empathy for the LGBT people living in Cuba. This occasion has also been remembered for its role in the gradual and successful removal of Virgilio Pinera from Cuba's official literary discourse by the regime. Initially considered a significant dramatist of the Cuban Revolution, Pinera eventually came under fire and was eventually taken into custody. He sent a letter to Carlos Quijano, the editor of a Uruguayan weekly, on this tour. The message was later retitled Socialism and Man in Cuba. Guevara's call for the emergence of a new consciousness, a new status for work, and a new role for the individual was outlined in the treatise. Additionally, he explained the rationale for his opposition to capitalism, saying, "The individual is subject to the blind and invisible laws of capitalism without even realizing it. All he can see in front of him is the immensity of an apparently endless horizon." That's the picture presented by capitalist propagandists who claim to be able to teach us anything about the potential for success by using Rockefeller as an example, whether or not that is accurate. It is not always feasible to make the general public aware of the extent of depravity that comes with the amassing of a wealth this size, nor the degree of poverty and suffering necessary for the rise of a Rockefeller. Guevara called on all revolutionaries to strive every day so that this love of living humanity will be transformed into acts that serve as examples and become a moving force, as she concluded the article, saying that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. Guevara's claims had their origins in his conviction that the Cuban Revolution represented something spiritual that would transcend all borders. Travel to Algeria and the shift in politics. On February 24, 1965, Guevara gave a speech at an economic conference on Afro-Asian cooperation in Algiers, Algeria, which ended up being his final public appearance on the international scene. He outlined the socialist nations' moral obligations and charged them with implicit collaboration with the Western nations that exploit them. He then went on to list certain steps that he believed the countries of the communist bloc needed to do in order to successfully resist imperialism. After publicly criticizing the Soviet Union, Cuba's main financial sponsor, he was met with a sad welcome at the Havana airport on March 14 by Fidel and Raúl Castro, Osvaldo Dorticos, and Carlos Rafael Rodriguez upon his return. Guevara had come to see the Northern Hemisphere, led by the US in the West and the Soviet Union in the East, as the oppressor of the Southern Hemisphere, as he had disclosed in his final statement in public in Algiers. He encouraged the people of other developing nations to take up arms and establish many Vietnams, and fervently supported Communist North Vietnam in the Vietnam War. Che's criticism of the Soviet Union won him favor with left-leaning intellectuals and artists who had grown weary of the Soviet Union, while his critique of imperialism and call for revolution enthralled young radical students in the US who were eager for social change. Guevara shows his growing disapproval of Soviet political economics at this period in his private letters, now published, claiming that the Soviets had forgotten Marx. Guevara used this opportunity to criticize a number of Soviet policies, including as their dangerous goal of peaceful coexistence with the United States, their attempt to airbrush the inherent violence of class struggle integral to the transition from capitalism to socialism, and more. Their attempts to liberalize the socialist economy and their inability to advocate for a change in consciousness on the concept of work. The Soviets contended that Guevara's demands for the total abolition of money, interest, commodity production, the market economy, and mercantile relationships would only materialize the realization of global communism. Guevara, who disagreed with this incrementalist strategy, attacked the Soviet Manual of Political Economy and accurately predicted that capitalism would eventually return to the Soviet Union if the law of value was not abolished, as Guevara had demanded. After returning to Cuba and giving his address in Algiers, Guevara disappeared from view for 2 weeks. As he was widely considered to be Castro's deputy, his whereabouts remained a major mystery throughout Cuba. Many reasons have been offered for his disappearance, including the failure of the industrialization plan for Cuba that he had supported as Minister of Industries. Pressure from Soviet officials against Castro because of Guevara's support for Chinese communism during the Sino-Soviet split, and significant disagreements between the pragmatic Castro and Guevara regarding Cuba's economic progress and ideological stance. Driven by global conjecture concerning Guevara's whereabouts, Castro declared on June 16, 1965, that the populace would get updates only when Guevara himself desired to do so. Still, There were speculations regarding Guevara's whereabouts that circulated both inside and outside of Cuba. Retired Cuban officials who were in the vicinity of the Castro brothers have spread a number of tales, including one claiming the two had a heated argument following Guevara's speech in Algiers. Following Che Guevara's return from Africa, Fidel Castro and Guevara had a number of heated arguments, which are detailed in intelligence files from the East German embassy in Cuba. It is unclear if Castro agreed with Guevara's critiques of the Soviet Union or just thought they were useless to voice on a global scale. Castro made an undated letter, later dubbed Che Guevara's farewell letter, publicly available on October 3, 1965. The letter was allegedly written to Castro by Guevara approximately 7 months prior. Guevara stated in the letter that he would be leaving Cuba to fight for the revolution abroad, but he also reiterated his unwavering support for the Cuban Revolution. He also surrendered his honorary Cuban citizenship and resigned from all of his posts inside the Communist Party and administration of Cuba. Congo crisis, the role of the military. Guevara traveled to Africa at the beginning of 1965 in order to contribute his guerrilla skills and knowledge to the ongoing battle in the Congo. Guevara believed that Africa had great revolutionary potential because it was imperialism's weak link, according to Algerian President Ahmed Ben Bella. Guevara's plan to fight in the Congo was viewed as unwise by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had brotherly relations with Che since his 1959 visit, and foretold that he would turn into a failure-prone Tarzan figure. Guevara used the alias Ramon Benitez to travel to Congo in spite of the warning. He oversaw the Cuban operation that supported the Simba movement, a Marxist force that arose out of the continuous conflict in the Congo. On April 24, 1965, Guevara, his second-in-command Victor Drake, and 12 other Cuban expeditionaries arrived in Congo. Shortly after, a group of about 100 Afro-Cubans joined them. They temporarily worked along with guerrilla chief Laurent Desire Kabila, who had assisted followers of deposed Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba in organizing a failed uprising few months prior. Guevara, who was an admirer of Lumumba, said that his murder should be a lesson for all of us. Guevara was given the young interpreter Freddie Alanga because of his weak grasp of Swahili and the native tongues. After a period of 7 months, Alanga developed a growing admiration for the diligent Guevara, who treated black people with the same respect as he did white people. The lack of discipline among Kabila's soldiers quickly disenchanted Guevara, who later fired him with the comment that nothing leads me to believe he is the man of the hour. Still, Che thought better of Kabila than of other Simba leaders, some of whom continued to pose as rebel commanders after they had fled into exile. Another challenge came from the fact that the CIA and anti-Castro Cuban pilots helped the mercenary forces under Micor lead the Armée Nationale Congolaise, or ANC, the military of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Guevara's moves from his base camp in the mountains close to the settlement of Fizi on Lake Tanganyika in the southeast of the Congo were obstructed by these forces. Because they could keep an eye on his communications, they were able to anticipate his attacks and cut off his supplies. Guevara attempted to hide his presence in the Congo, but the US government was aware of his whereabouts and activities. All of his communications, both in and out, were being monitored by the National Security Agency through equipment on board the USNS Private Jose F. Valdez, a listening station that was constantly cruising the Indian Ocean off the coast of Dar es Salaam for that exact purpose. Hoare devised his plans to specifically oppose the Communist Cubans' use of guerrilla warfare after learning of their presence in the eastern Congo. Guevara wanted to teach local anti-Mobutu Simba rebels Marxist philosophy and Foucault theory guerrilla warfare tactics in order to export the revolution. He lists the Congolese rebels' infighting, intransigence, and incompetence as the main causes of the uprising's demise in his book Congo Diary. In an effort to eliminate Kabila's army, the ANC and its allies started Operation South in September 1965. The Simbas put up a strong fight with the help of Che and his Cubans. Nevertheless, the rebels suffered from dwindling morale, were driven farther and farther back, and lost their supply lines. Guevara nearly lost his life during one of the operation's conflicts. Nevertheless, even his Simba supporters eventually informed him that the uprising had been put down, despite his initial desire to carry out some kind of guerrilla campaign from the nearby mountains. On November 20, 1965, Guevara and the 6 Cuban survivors of his 12-man column left Congo, exhausted by 7 months of losses and inaction and suffering from acute asthma and dysentery. Guevara said that as a revolutionary example, he had intended to send the injured back to Cuba and fight in the Congo by himself till the end. But in the closing moments, he reluctantly consented to depart Africa at the behest of his allies and 2 directly sent by Castro. Guevara's soldiers dismantled their base camp covertly during that day and night, set fire to their tents, and destroyed or dumped any weapons they could not take with them into Lake Tanganyika. At night, they crossed the border into Tanzania by boat and proceeded to Dar es Salaam on land. Speaking months later, Guevara came to the conclusion that he left the Congo rather than fighting to the death because the human element failed. The will to fight is absent. The rebel commanders are dishonest. There was, to put it simply, nothing to be done. Additionally, Guevara said, "We cannot liberate, all by ourselves, a country that does not want to fight." A few weeks later, he penned the opening line in his journal, which he preserved throughout the Congo venture. "This is the story of a failure. Escape from the Democratic Republic of the Congo." Guevara was hesitant to return to Cuba after the Congolese rebellion failed because Castro had already made public the farewell letter he wrote, which was meant to be revealed only in the event of his death and in which he severed all ties in order to dedicate himself to revolution worldwide. Guevara consequently lived in secret for the following 6 months, first at the Cuban embassy in Dar es Salaam and then at a safe house in Ladvi, which is close to Prague. Guevara confided in former Argentine President Juan Perón, who was living in exile in Francoist Spain, during a covert visit to Perón while he was in Europe about his new plan to organize a communist revolution that would subjugate all of Latin America under socialist rule. Guevara was already set on launching a communist revolution throughout Latin America, beginning with Bolivia, despite Perón's warnings that his ideas would be suicidal and useless. Guevara was described as an immature utopian, but one of us, by Perón later on. "He is really giving the Yankees a headache, so I'm glad that is the case." While he was away, Guevara wrote his memoirs on his experiences in the Congo. 2 other volumes, one on philosophy and the other on economics, were drafted by D. On July 21, 1966, Guevara returned to Cuba in secret while getting ready to leave for Bolivia. While there, he saw Castro, his wife, and wrote his 5 children a farewell letter that would be read to them after his passing. In it, he gave them the following instructions. Above all, never lose the ability to feel the depth of injustice done to anyone, anywhere in the world. The most exquisite feature of a revolutionary is this: Bolivian insurgency. Departure to Bolivia. Although Guevara's whereabouts remained a mystery in late 1966, members of the Frelimo, the Mozambican independence movement, claimed to have met with him in Dar es Salaam to discuss his offer to assist them in their revolutionary endeavors, an offer they ultimately turned down. Guevara was declared to be serving the revolution somewhere in Latin America by Major Juan Almeida Bosque, the acting minister of the armed forces, during a speech at the 1967 International Workers' Day demonstration in Havana. Based on top-secret records preserved in the UNESCO-protected archives of terror in Paraguay, French writer Pablo Daniel Magui reconstructs the first Che Guevara invasion in Bolivia on October 3, 1966, in his 2020 book Operation Condor. Guevara changed his appearance before leaving for Bolivia by chopping off a large portion of his hair and dyeing it gray, making him seem nothing like Che Guevara. Under the false name Adolfo Mina Gonzalez, Guevara landed in La Paz surreptitiously on a flight from Montevideo on November 3, 1966, pretending to be a middle-aged Uruguayan businessman employed by the Organization of American States. Guevara departed La Paz for the rural southeast of the nation 3 days after arriving in order to organize his guerrilla force. Guevara's first base camp was situated in the isolated Nankawaza region, amid a montane dry forest. It was dangerous to train at the camp in the Nankawaza Valley, and not much progress was made toward assembling a guerrilla army. Che's main agent in La Paz was now Tamara Bunke, an East German agent born in Argentina who went by Tanya in her covert identity. Nankawazu Rebellion. About 50 men made up Guevara's guerrilla group, which was known as the ELN, Ejército de Liberación Nacional de Bolivia, or National Liberation Army of Bolivia. The group was well-equipped and had several early victories over regular members of the Bolivian army in the challenging Camiri region during the first few months of 1967. Guevara's forces defeated Bolivian forces in multiple encounters during the spring and summer of 1967. The insurgent forces' actual size was being exaggerated by the Bolivian government. Scholars speculate that Guevara's strategy to incite a revolution in Bolivia was unsuccessful for a number of reasons. Guevara did not obtain the support he had anticipated from the local dissidents, nor did he receive backing from the Mario Monge-led Communist Party of Bolivia, which had its sights set on Moscow rather than Havana. Guevara complained about the Communist Party of Bolivia in his own notebook, which was discovered after his death. He called the party distrustful, disloyal, and stupid. He had assumed that he would only be dealing with the inadequately armed and trained Bolivian military, and was not aware that the CIA's Special Activities Division commandos, along with other operations, had been dispatched by the U.S. government to Bolivia to support the counterinsurgency efforts. U.S. Army Special Forces, which included an elite battalion of U.S. Rangers skilled in jungle combat and billeted in La Esperanza, a little village near Guevara's guerrilla stronghold, also provided training, advice, and supplies to the Bolivian army. He had anticipated staying in radio communication with Havana. Cuba had given him 2 shortwave radio transmitters, but they were broken. As a result, the rebels were left trapped and isolated as they could not communicate or receive supplies. Guevara's reluctance to establish fruitful working ties with local rebel commanders in Bolivia was also influenced by his well-known predilection for conflict over compromise, which had earlier shown itself during his guerrilla warfare campaign in Cuba, as it had in the Congo. Under Cuba, this inclination had existed, but Fidel Castro's prompt actions and direction had kept it under check. As a result, throughout his 11-month recruitment campaign, Guevara was unable to persuade locals to enlist in his militia. Many locals voluntarily told the Bolivian military and government about the rebels and their activities in the region. Talking to these peasants is like talking to statues, Guevara wrote in his diary near the conclusion of his expedition in Bolivia. They don't offer us any assistance. Even worse, a large number of them are becoming informants. Felix Rodriguez, a former Cuban exile who joined the CIA's Special Activities Division, provided guidance to Bolivian forces while they searched Bolivia for Guevara. Furthermore, according to the documentary My Enemy's Enemy from 2007, Klaus Barbie, a Nazi war criminal, advised and possibly assisted the CIA in planning Guevara's eventual capture. Obtain. The Bolivian Special Forces were informed on October 7, 1967, by an informant where Guevara's guerrilla camp was located in the Euro Ravine. Leading a detachment alongside Simeon Cuba Sarabia, Guevara was wounded and taken prisoner during the conflict that broke out when they surrounded the region early on October 8 with 2 companies totaling 180 soldiers. According to Bolivian Sergeant Bernardino Huanca, who was informed by Che's author John Lee Anderson, when the Bolivian Rangers arrived, a twice-wounded Guevara, his gun rendered useless, put up his arms in surrender and yelled to the soldiers, "Do not shoot. I am Che Guevara, and you value me more while I'm living than when I'm dead." On the evening of October 8, Guevara was bound and brought to a rundown mud schoolhouse in the nearby community of La Higuera. Guevara spoke to Bolivian soldiers in silence and declined to be questioned by Bolivian officials for the following 6 hours. Che appears dreadful to Jaime Nino de Guzman, a helicopter pilot who was one of those Bolivian soldiers. Guzman claimed that Guevara had a bullet wound to his right calf, that his clothes were torn, that his hair was matted with mud, and that rough leather sheaths wrapped his feet. He describes how, in spite of his disheveled appearance, Che held his head high, looked everyone straight in the eyes and asked only for something to smoke. According to de Guzman, Guevara took pity on him and thanked him after receiving a little quantity of tobacco for his pipe. Later on October 8, even though he was handcuffed, Guevara kicked Captain Espinosa, a Bolivian army officer, against a wall when the officer entered the classroom and attempted to take Guevara's pipe out of his mouth as a memento while he was still smoking it. A few hours before his execution, Guevara again showed defiance by spitting in the face of Bolivian Rear Admiral Horacio Ugarte during an attempt to question him. On October 9, the next morning, Guevara made an appointment to see the village's 22-year-old schoolteacher, Julia Cortez. She subsequently said that she thought Guevara was an agreeable-looking man with a soft and ironic glance, and that she was unable to look him in the eye because of his gaze, which was unbearable, piercing, and so tranquil throughout their chat. In their brief exchange, Guevara brought up the dilapidated state of the school and remarked that it was anti-pedagogical for campesino youngsters to receive an education there while government officials drive Mercedes cars. Guevara said, "That's what we are fighting against." Implementation. René Barrientos, the president of Bolivia, gave the order to execute Guevara later that morning on October 9. Felix Rodriguez apparently sent the directive to the Guevara unit, even though the U.S. administration preferred to send Guevara to Panama for more questioning. Mario Terán, a 27-year-old Bolivian army sergeant, was the executioner who offered to kill Guevara. Despite being partially intoxicated, he asked to shoot Guevara because 3 of his B Company friends, who shared the same first name, had been killed in a firefight with Guevara's guerrilla group a few days prior. Felix Rodriguez gave Terán the order to avoid shooting Guevara in the head and instead to carefully aim to give the impression that the rebel had been killed in action during a battle with the Bolivian army, in order to make the bullet wounds appear consistent with the version of events that the government of Bolivia intended to tell the public. According to Gary Prado Salmon, the captain of the Bolivian army company that captured Guevara, Barrientos ordered Guevara's immediate execution to prevent Guevara from escaping prison and to avoid any drama surrounding a public trial that could result in negative publicity. Felix Rodriguez tried to question Guevara about the whereabouts of other guerrilla soldiers who were still at large roughly 30 minutes before Guevara was killed, but Guevara remained silent. With the aid of a few Bolivian troops, Rodriguez helped Guevara stand up and led him outside the hut to be paraded before other Bolivian soldiers. There, he posed for pictures with Guevara, with one soldier taking a picture of Rodriguez and other soldiers standing next to Guevara. Subsequently, Rodriguez informed Guevara that he would be put to death. A few moments later, one of the Bolivian soldiers on guard asked Guevara if he was considering his own immortality. "No," he said, "I'm thinking about the immortality of the revolution." Guevara allegedly rose up and said to Sergeant Terán, "I know you've come to kill me," just before Terán entered the hut a few minutes later to shoot him. "Oh, you coward! You will only succeed in killing one man." After a moment of hesitation, Terán fired his self-loading M2 carbine at Guevara, striking him in the arms and legs. Terán then shot another burst, fatally striking Guevara in the chest as he writhed on the ground, seemingly biting one of his wrists to stop himself from screaming. As per Rodriguez, Guevara was declared deceased at 1:10 p.m. local time. Terán shot Guevara 9 times in all. There were 5 of these in his legs, 1 in his right arm and shoulder, and 1 in his chest and throat. It was months before Guevara had written his own epitaph, declaring months before during his final public speech to the Tricontinental Conference. "Wherever death may surprise us, let it be welcome, provided that this our battle cry may have reached some receptive ear and another hand may be extended to wield our weapons." Repercussions. Following his execution, Guevara's body was strapped to a helicopter's landing skids and transported to Valle Grande, which is close. There, pictures of Guevara laying on a concrete slab in the Nuestra Señora de Malta laundry room were taken. A number of witnesses were consulted in order to verify his identification, chief among them being British journalist Richard Gott, who was the only person to have encountered Guevara during his lifetime. Emaciated and on display, Guevara's body was viewed by many as a Christ-like face as hundreds of locals filed by it. Some even stole his hair, preserving it as a holy relic. 2 weeks later, English art critic John Berger noted that the post-mortem images bore similarities to two well-known paintings, Andrea Mantegna's Lamentation over the Dead Christ and Rembrandt's The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicolai's Tulp. This observation led to even more comparisons between the two works of art. Additionally, four correspondents were present when Guevara's body landed in Valle Grande. Among them was Bjorn Kumm from the Swedish Aftonbladet, who wrote an exclusive article for the New Republic on November 11, 1967, describing the event. The plan to murder Guevara was deemed stupid but understandable from a Bolivian standpoint in a declassified document written by National Security Advisor Walt Rostow and sent to U.S. President Lyndon B. Johnson on October 11, 1967. Following the death, Guevara's personal belongings were taken by Rodriguez, including a watch that he wore for many years and frequently displayed to reporters. Some of these items are on exhibit at the CIA today, including his flashlight. Following the amputation of his hands by a military physician, Guevara's body was moved by Bolivian army officials to an unidentified site. They declined to say if his remains were interred or incinerated. The hands were shipped to Buenos Aires so that fingerprints could be obtained. Later, they were dispatched to Cuba. Guevara's death was officially announced by Fidel Castro on October 15, in Havana, and 3 days of nationwide public mourning were declared. Speaking to 1 million mourners at Havana's Plaza de la Revolution on October 18, Castro discussed Guevara's qualities as a revolutionary. In this way, Fidel Castro concluded his passionate eulogy. "Let the men of the future be like Che, we must say, if we are to convey our desires for them. Without hesitation, we must state our wishes for our children's education. We want them to be educated in the spirit of Che. I sincerely believe that Che is the ideal man to follow if we're looking for someone who is not a product of our time but rather of the future. He has impeccable morals and actions." When Guevara was apprehended, his handwritten notebook including 30,000 words, a compilation of his own poetry, and a brief narrative he had written about a teenage guerrilla communist who conquers his worries. His diary, which was kept between November 7, 1966, when he arrived at the farm in Nankawazu, and October 7, 1967, the day before he was captured, detailed the events of the guerrilla struggle in Bolivia. The journal discusses Guevara's decision to split the column into two units that were later unable to re-establish contact, details how the guerrillas were obliged to start operations early due to discovery by the Bolivian army, and details their overall disastrous endeavor. It also documents the break that developed between Guevara and the Bolivian Communist Party, which led to Guevara having a lot fewer soldiers than anticipated. It demonstrates that Guevara faced significant challenges in recruiting from the local population, in part because the guerrilla group had acquired Quechua without realizing that the language spoken there was actually Tupi-Guarani. Guevara's health deteriorated as the campaign came to an abrupt end. He suffered from asthma attacks that kept becoming worse, and the most of his final attacks were motivated by a desire to get medication. Ramparts magazine rapidly and clumsily translated the Bolivian diaries, which was then distributed globally. At least 4 other diaries, authored by Israel Reyes Zayas, also known as Braulio, Eliseo Reyes Rodriguez, Rolando, Harry Villegas Tamayo, Pombo, and Daryl Alarcón Ramirez, Benino, are known to exist. These diaries each provide more details about the events. In an interview from prison in August 1968, French scholar Regis Debray, who was seized in April 1967 while traveling with Guevara in Bolivia, explained in further detail the events behind Guevara's imprisonment. Debray, who briefly cohabited with Guevara's guerrilla group, expressed his belief that they were victims of the forest and thus eaten by the jungle. Debray detailed the impoverished state in which Guevara's men had only 6 blankets for a total of 22 men, were malnourished, and had no access to water or shoes. According to Debray, Guevara and the others had been afflicted with a disease that resulted in their hands and feet swelling into masses of skin, so big you could not see the digits on them. Debray said that despite the hopeless circumstances, Guevara was optimistic about the future of Latin America and that he was resigned to die in the knowledge that his death would be a sort of renaissance, adding that Guevara saw death as a ritual of renewal and the promise of rebirth. History. Political left. In response to Guevara's seeming lack of interest in accolades or glory, radical left-wing militants agreed that violence was necessary to impose socialist beliefs. Students started dressing like Guevara, even in the US government that he so vehemently criticized, wearing military fatigues, berets, and growing facial hair and beards to demonstrate their opposition to US foreign policy. For example, the Arab insurgents named combat operations after him, and the Black Panthers started dressing like Che type and donning his signature black beret. The director of the 2008 documentary Chevolution, Tricia Ziff, has said of the legacy's immense adaptability that Che Guevara's significance in modern times is less about the guy and his particular background, as well as more about the goals of building a better society. Similarly, Guevara's enduring appeal may stem from the fact that nothing could be more vicariously gratifying than Che's disdain for material comfort and everyday desires to those who will never follow in his footsteps, submerged as they are in a world of cynicism, self-interest, and frantic consumption. This is according to Chilean writer Ariel Dorfman. Guevara's belief in a figurative resurrection after death partially materialized. Che Guevara's fame grew as images of the deceased man started making the rounds and discussions centered on how he died. International protests against his assassination took place, and publications, homages, several poetry concerning his life and demise were composed. We had rallies from Mexico to Santiago, Algiers to Angola, and Cairo to Calcutta in favor of Guevara. In remembrance of Guevara, people lighted candles in Budapest and Prague, and images of a grinning Che surfaced in London and Paris. A few months later, young men and women were wearing Che Guevara t-shirts and carrying his photos on their protest marches when riots broke out in Berlin, France, and Chicago, and the turmoil extended to American college campuses. According to military historian Eric Derschmied, Che Guevara was alive and well throughout those intense months in 1968. He was very much in the present. Recovery of remains. The body of Che Guevara was discovered next to an airport in Valle Grande, as the retired Bolivian General Mario Vargas disclosed to John Lee Anderson, the author of Che Guevara, A Revolutionary Life, in late 1995. The outcome was a more than a year-long, multinational search for the remains. A group of forensic anthropologists from Argentina and geologists from Cuba found the remains of 7 individuals in 2 mass graves in July 1997, including one man who didn't have hands, like Che Guevara. The body was later recognized as Guevara by Bolivian government officials working with the Ministry of Interior after the unearthed teeth perfectly matched a plaster impression of Che's teeth prepared in Cuba before his Congolese expedition. The clincher came when Argentine forensic anthropologist Alejandro Incharegui discovered a tiny bag of pipe tobacco inside the concealed pocket of a blue jacket that had been dug up near to the handless cadaver. After giving Che a little bag of tobacco, the Bolivian chopper pilot Nino de Guzman later said that he had serious doubts at first and thought the Cubans would just find any old bones and call it Che. Nevertheless, after hearing about the tobacco pouch, I have no doubts. The remains of Guevara and 6 other combatants were interred with military honors on October 17, 1997, 30 years and 8 days after his death, in a specially constructed mausoleum in the Cuban city of Santa Clara, where he had presided over the decisive military victory of the Cuban Revolution. A logbook, numerous black and white photos, and Guevara's previously sealed diaries written in 2 ragged notebooks were revealed by Evo Morales' Bolivian administration in July 2008. Pablo Gru, Bolivia's Vice Minister of Culture, announced at the event that pictures of each handwritten page would be released later in the year. Meanwhile, anthropologists employed by Bolivia's Justice Ministry found in August 2009, and discovered the corpses of 5 of Guevara's comrades in the Tiaponte, Bolivia, area. The finding of Che's remains metonymically triggered a chain reaction of interconnected connotations that did not have a clear division between them: rebel, martyr, renegade, radical, savior, from a picaresque adventure. Presently, opinions about Che vary greatly. Some see him as a misguided rebel, others as a coruscatingly brilliant guerrilla philosopher, Still others see him as a poet-warrior jousting at windmills. Still others as a brazen warrior who laid down the gauntlet to the bourgeoisie. Still others as a mass murderer dressed in the garb of an avenging angel, whose every action is imbued with violence, the quintessential fanatical terrorist. Debate about biographies. The legacy and life of Guevara are still controversial. A complex, dualistic character, who was able to wield the pen and submachine gun with equal skill, and who predicted that the most important revolutionary ambition was to see man liberated from his alienation, was created by the apparent contradictions of his ethos at different points in his life. Guevara's paradoxical position is made much more difficult by the variety of seemingly incompatible traits he possesses. An idealistic scholar who loved literature but forbade dissent, a well-known internationalist leader who supported violence to uphold an idealistic ideology of the common good, a secular humanist and compassionate physician who did not think twice to shoot his adversaries. Lastly, there is the vocal anti-capitalist whose image has become commodity, and an anti-imperialist Marxist rebel who was radically determined to construct a society without poverty on the apocalyptic ashes of the old one. Che's past is still being revised and reinterpreted. Sociologist Michael Lowy further argues that Guevara's multifarious life, as a physician and economist, revolutionary and banker, military theorist and ambassador, deep thinker and political agitator, etc., helped to shed light on the emergence of the Che myth, which made it possible for him to become permanently embedded in his various meta-narrative personas as a Red Robin Hood, Don Quixote of communism, New Garibaldi, Marxist Saint Just, Cid Campeador of the wretched of the earth, Sir Galahad of the beggars, and the Bolshevik demon, who lights global braziers of rebellion by haunting the dreams of the wealthy. Because of this, Guevara has received praise from many well-known people. Nelson Mandela, for instance, called him an inspiration for every human being who loves freedom, while Jean-Paul Sartre said that he was not only an intellectual but also the most complete human being of our age. Authors Graham Greene and Susan Sontag have both expressed respect for Guevara, stating that she represented the idea of gallantry, chivalry, and adventure, and that Che's goal was nothing less than the cause of humanity itself. Guevara was hailed as the world symbol of the possibilities of one man by philosopher Frantz Fanon within the Pan-African community, while Black Power activist Stokely Carmichael declared that Che Guevara is not dead, his ideas are with us. Libertarian theorist Murray Rothbard has praised Guevara as a heroic figure, who, more than any man of our epoch or even of our century, was the living embodiment of the principle of revolution. Journalist Christopher Hitchens has reflected on his time with the revolutionary leader, saying, "Che's death meant a lot to me and countless like me at the time. He was a role model, albeit an impossible one for us bourgeois romantics insofar as you can die for his beliefs." Philip Agee, a former CIA worker, stated, "There was no person more feared by the company, CIA, than Che Guevara because he had the capacity and charisma necessary to direct the struggle against the political repression of the traditional hierarchies in power in the countries of Latin America." On the other hand, opposition writer in exile Jacobo Mechover brushes off any positive comments about Guevara and describes him as a cold-blooded killer. Similar views have been voiced by exiled former Cuban prisoners, such as Armando Valladares, who called Guevara a man full of hatred, and claimed that he executed dozens of people without a trial, and Carlos Alberto Montaner, who claimed that Guevara had a Robespierre mentality, in which it was honorable to be cruel to the enemies of the revolution. Alvaro Vargas Llosa of the Independent Institute has conjectured that Guevara's modern-day adherents delude themselves by clinging to a myth, characterizing Guevara as a Marxist Puritan, who utilized his inflexible authority to quell opposition while simultaneously functioning as a cold-blooded killing machine. In addition, Llosa speculates that Guevara's total subordination of reality to blind ideological orthodoxy was the driving force behind the Sovietization of the Cuban Revolution because of his fanatical disposition. Macro-level, Latin American culture that inclined people to seek out and follow paternalistic miracle workers produced the fearless and headstrong messiah-like figure known as Che Guevara. Hoover Institution research fellow William Ratliff views Guevara more as a product of his historical setting. Ratliff goes on to speculate that the region's economic circumstances fit Guevara's mission to bring justice to the downtrodden by crushing centuries-old tyrannies, characterizing Latin America as afflicted by poverty, inequality, dysfunctional politics, and broken institutions, what Moises Naim called the legendary malignancies. British historian Hugh Thomas gave Guevara mixed reviews, saying he was a brave, sincere, and determined man who was also obstinate, narrow, and dogmatic. Thomas notes that he seems to have become convinced of the virtues of violence for its own sake at the end of his life, and that his influence over Castro for good or evil increased as Fidel adopted many of his beliefs after his passing. Similar to this, Che Guevara is praised as an honest and committed revolutionary by Cuban-American sociologist Samuel Farber, who also takes issue with the fact that he never embraced socialism in its most democratic essence. Guevara is still revered as a national hero in Cuba, though, where his picture appears on the 3-peso bill and students start their school days with the phrase, "We will be like Che." In 2008, a 3.5-meter, 12-foot, bronze statue of Che was dedicated in the city of his birth, Rosario. Che is well known throughout his native Argentina, where high schools bear his name. Some Bolivian villagers have sanctified Guevara as Saint Ernesto, and they pray to him for help. On the other hand, Guevara continues to be despised by many in the American-Cuban community and in Cuban exile, who refer to him as the Butcher of La Cabana. Despite this divisive status, Irish artist Jim Fitzpatrick's 1968 high-contrast monochrome graphic of Che Guevara's face became a widely merchandised and objectified image that could be found on a plethora of products, including t-shirts, hats, posters, tattoos, and bikinis, adding to the consumer culture that Guevara detested. Nevertheless, he continues to be a transcendent figure in a variety of popular situations related to teenage revolt as well as in particularly political ones. Thank you for taking the time to engage with our content. We're delighted you enjoyed this article and would love to hear your feedback. Your feedback is really valuable to us, so please share it in the comments box below. If you're new and want to remain up to date on our latest material, subscribe to the Up First Time channel. By subscribing, you will be the first to learn about our new stories and videos, ensuring that you never miss out on any of the excitement. But we're more than just distributing material, we're also about creating a community. That is why we value your feedback so highly. If you have any recommendations or themes you'd like us to look into more, please leave them in the comments. We're always looking for new ideas and eager to hear from our viewers. And, speaking of ideas, if you're as enthusiastic about this subject or person as we are, have you considered doing a whole documentary? Your unique thoughts and viewpoints could be extremely beneficial to others, and presenting them in a documentary style could help you reach an even larger audience. This is something to think about. Finally, remember to click the like button and share this video with your friends and family. Let's work together to expand our community and welcome new members to the Up First Time family. Your support is invaluable to us, and we could not do it without you. Thank you again for your support, and we look forward to continuing this great journey with you.